So what I'm going to talk about today is conjoint analysis. And in essence, as on my first slide, really what conjoint analysis is all about is finding out what people care about when they make choices. And so here's the sort of order of presentation today. I'm going to give an overview of conjoint analysis and software. My focus will be on 1000 Minds because that's the software I know the most of, but I will mention other ones as well. I'm also going to give you a demo. I'm going to let you do a 1000 Minds conjoint analysis survey to choose a smartphone, and it's a very cut down version of a survey just so that it'll only take a minute or two of our time. And I'll talk about the results. So the objective of the first part of the talk is to really bring everyone up to speed fully with understanding what conjoint analysis is, what sort of outputs and information and interpretations you can get and why it's useful. The level of this talk is really at a, I suppose, introductory to intermediate level. So I'm not going to get into some of the technical details. I'm happy to talk about those things offline, but I'm really trying to introduce the topic to everyone and show its usefulness. And one way that I'm going to do that is probably in the last 20 minutes or so of my talk, I'm going to run through very quickly three illustrations of conjoint analysis that have been published in journals that cover a wide range of areas, as you can see by the titles, from sort of consumer decision making, which is a big area of conjoint analysis, as I'll explain in just a moment, through to public policy decision making, and also looking at things like, surveying the general population to discover things like how people feel about environmental issues and whatnot. So that's sort of the order of play. And as I said, I will pause at certain points and ask if anyone's got questions, but please do feel free to interrupt or put a question in the chat and we'll try and address it as we go. Well, what is conjoint analysis? And by the way, actually, just let me roll that back a bit. So those of you who attended our other webinar that we gave about a month ago, it was all about multi-criteria decision making. And so those are the two aspects that 1000 Minds does. Multi-criteria decision making, of course, is about making decisions. Conjoint analysis is very similar, but it's actually quite a separate area. And it's really all about trying to discover how people in their various roles that they might have in society, say as consumers or citizens of a country, how much and in what way do they value the various characteristics or attributes, as they're referred to, of some sort of product or service, if it was a consumer goods application, or some other outcome that might be of interest to them, as, say, formulated by government policy. So conjoint analysis, which goes by quite a few other different terms as well, which I'll talk about in about 10 minutes once we've got the basic ideas across, is the most widely used technique in marketing research. I've read somewhere that something like over 10,000 conjoint analysis studies are conducted annually around the world. And it's a very big part of designing new products as well, because if you can discover what people want in whatever it is that you're looking at, say it's a consumer product or a service, then of course you can design that product. Conjoint analysis is a very widely used technique in research in the social scientists. So for economists and marketers and political scientists, psychologists, they use conjoint analysis a lot. In that respect, it's more often referred to as discrete choice experiments or choice modeling, but the ideas are very much the same. And as I said, I'll address some of this terminology in just a little while. And conjoint analysis is increasingly used for evaluating government policies to try and figure out, what do the citizens of the country particularly want in the policies that governments are thinking of introducing. So there are some examples, as you can see. So, think of all the different consumer products and goods and services that we might consume as people, and I'm going to use it as an example, mobile phones, but electronic goods, the food we consume, professional services, going to the doctor, hospitals, etc., are amenable to using conjoint analysis to discover what people want. And similarly, as I said, for figuring out what sort of policies government should introduce. So the punchline, if you like, of conjoint analysis and the purpose is to discover, what do people care about the most in whatever is being studied. And the objective, therefore, is once you understand that, if you've run a conjoint analysis, then you can design that ideal product or a policy so that you can sort of maximize the market share if you're in a consumer goods environment, or produce a policy or introduce a change to government that would get the most approval from the citizens. So that's obviously a very attractive thing to be able to do if you're either a consumer goods manufacturer or a government agency. And I'm going to go through lots of examples, so don't worry, this will become very clear as we proceed. But in essence, the key idea behind conjoint analysis and all these different applications is that any product that we're looking at, or a service, or say a government policy, is capable of being sort of decomposed or broken down into a set of characteristics or attributes that people value. And so what we want to find out is what are those attributes and how much do they value them. So a couple of examples. We'll use smartphones a lot. I'm holding up my one because smartphones, I think, is a product that most of us are fairly familiar with. So, to a person conducting conjoint analysis, to a marketer, to a designer, what is a smartphone? Well, a smartphone is a collection of attributes. I've got some bullet pointed ones there that make up that product. And so conjoint analysis used in this sort of setting would be obviously very interested in, well, firstly, what do people care about, but in particular for different consumers, how important is the length of the battery life relative to, say, the quality of the screen and the camera that they might have available, and how sensitive to the price are the consumers. So if we can gather that information and discover the relative importance of each of those different things, and notice I've got etc. there too, there'll be other features or attributes that are important when thinking about smartphones for different consumers. If we knew that information, and if we were Samsung or Apple, we could obviously produce that smartphone and deliver it to the consumers. And this is what a lot of businesses, and certainly those ones that I mentioned, do. Almost certainly all the major manufacturers of consumer goods around the world have used conjoint analysis to discover what their consumers are likely to desire in the product or the service that they're delivering. And the same thing in my second example can be said at the government level. So I'll go through this in more detail towards the end of my talk. But if you're a government, and this is a real world example from the country that I'm from New Zealand, if you're trying to design a retirement income policy, so a pension policy or a superannuation policy, wouldn't it be nice to know how, in my own country's case, how the 5 million people who live in New Zealand, how they feel about the different features or attributes that would go into that policy. So those bullet points there are fairly standard sort of characteristics of such a policy that a government agency, in this case in New Zealand, the Treasury, is able to tweak and refine when designing a policy that they're going to introduce, in the future, that could be around for 50 or, if we're lucky, maybe 100 years. So finding out how people feel about each of those attributes, each of those bullet points, and again, notice the etc. There's probably other features as well that are important, is going to be very, very useful for such an agency trying to design a policy that people are going to feel happy with. And there's lots of other examples. So, here's each of these examples are ones that I've seen 1,000 minds used for, but there's literally hundreds of other ones. And notice in all of them, they're all about sort of, the characteristics that appeal most to people when donating money to countries in need. Those first three on my list are the ones that I'll use as an example later in the talk. An issue of what could you do to increase the uptake of electric cars in a country. So obviously discovering what people care about when they make a choice about an electric car versus a petrol or a diesel car would be important both to the manufacturers of those vehicles, but also to the regulatory authorities. Understanding the different characteristics of the various services that we consume, a whole range of environmental applications. So these are all, fairly interesting, I think, applications of conjoint analysis in order to discover people's preferences and try and use that information, hopefully in a fairly constructive manner. Just a little bit of background. I'm an economist by profession and training. And one of the reasons I love conjoint analysis so much is because it sort of lies at the intersection of the subject that I love, economics, but also psychology and very much marketing research. And so those three disciplines, and I guess computer science as well, because increasingly the tools and approaches are being implemented using software. But it's a big part of psychology, because we're trying to understand how people think and feel and ultimately choose things, which is obviously important, a part of cognitive, the thinking side of psychology, but also the mathematical, because you might try and model that. The Nobel Prize in 2000 in economic sciences was awarded to Daniel McFadden for his work in what's known as discrete choice experiments in the economics field, but that's really just another term for conjoint analysis, and certainly that lent a lot of prestige, if you like, to the area as a whole. But as the diagram's trying to represent, conjoint analysis lies at the intersection of at least those three subjects, and possibly others as well. So let's just sort of very quickly go through sort of the main components and make sure we're comfortable with some of the terminology and really explain the concepts at work here. So I'm going to use, and I'm going to give you a chance to do a survey yourself, a conjoint analysis survey, to discover, what are the attributes that are important when thinking about a smartphone as a consumer. And I'll use this example here, so we will return to this a few times, but here's an example, okay? So here are some attributes, and those are the same bullet points as I had a couple of slides ago. And so conjoint analysis is based on attributes to describe the thing that's being studied, and attributes are really just characteristics or features of whatever it is that we're looking at. And each of these attributes, as you can see on my slide, has a number of levels of performance or characterization. So battery life, you can see, ranges from short to medium to long, and there's just 3 levels, just to make it nice and simple. Of course, we could have more than 3. And the usual idea is that the levels are sort of in increasing order of desirability. So a battery that lasts for a long time would be more desirable than one that just lasts for a short time for a consumer. And then, of course, for a lot of consumer applications, an important attribute is going to be the price of the goods. So here are sort of 5 price points for a smartphone, I suppose a medium range smartphone. And again, we could have much more granularity to that if we wanted to, but I've made it as simple as possible. Operating speed, made that very qualitative. And again, these different levels and descriptions can be quantitative, like in the price and the battery life. They can be qualitative. They can be a mixture. I suppose the battery life is one more of a mixture. It's got a sort of a short a word to describe it, and a little bit of an explanation quantitatively what short, medium, and long might look like. But for the simplicity of what I'm going to ask you to do in just a moment, I've made these very, very short and very, very brief. But of course, there's lots of latitude when you're setting these things up. And that of course, is really the art of designing a conjoint analysis. What are the attributes that we would use to describe the thing that we want to study, and what are the levels and what are the words that we would want to use. Okay, now the second part, and you can see it in the screen, is a set of numbers down the middle there, and they're known as part worth utilities oftentimes, or sometimes just part worths or utilities. And that's just really fancy jargon for weights. These numbers are weights representing the relative importance of the different attributes and their levels to the consumer who undertook, or who was the participant in the conjoint analysis, or the group of consumers if these are mean results. So I'm going to show you how these numbers are generated in just a moment by giving you a survey to do yourself. But let's take these numbers sort of as the result of a conjoint analysis. It's quite easy to interpret them. Just imagine it this way. So imagine a smartphone that, as described in terms of these attributes and levels, that was the best possible hypothetical phone that you could ever see. Well, it would have a long battery life, the best level 1 battery life. It would be relatively cheap, $600. Operating speed, screen quality, and camera quality would all be very good. And so basically what we do is we could describe, or we could score and work out a total score and a number representing the value of that particular combination of attributes describing a particular phone by adding up the numbers that we see. So if we add the bolded numbers there representing the best performance in each of the attributes, 32 plus 30.5, 16.1, 13.4 down to 8, those 5 numbers add to 100 points. And that's why they've got the percentage sign beside them. So think of it this way. hypothetically speaking, the best phone that could ever be represented in this system here would get a score of 100. Go to the other extreme, a short battery life, an expensive phone, operating speed's just okay, okay quality of the screen, and same for the camera. That's the worst describable phone on this system here. Of course, adding the zeros gives us a score of 0. So therefore, every combination, so different combinations of the attributes describing different representations of the phone, which is really what I'm talking about in my third yellow bit here, that what are known as concepts, profiles, or alternatives. Every combination describing either a real phone or an imaginary hypothetical phone can be scored between 100 for the very best and 0 for the very worst. Now, the reason I'm emphasizing that is, if these numbers represented, say, my preferences as a consumer who did the survey that, by the way, I'm going to ask you to do in just a moment, that would mean out of 100 points maximum going on phones, Paul Hansen is allocating 32 of those 100 on the battery life. So that's representing the relative importance of the battery life as an attribute to this consumer. So 32 out of 100, and roughly, in other words, a third of the value that the person attaches to thinking about the best phone is going on that attribute. And these are in ranked order, you can see, just for presentation purposes. The second most important thing to me would be price. That's funny for an economist, that would usually be at the top. And then coming in a third, fourth, and a distant fifth are the other three attributes there. And so, this is presenting very detailed information, if you like, codifying how the particular consumer feels about these different attributes and their different levels on them. So we can say things like, obviously, battery life is most important here, camera quality is least important. We can even go further, because we've got numbers. We can say that battery life getting a score of 32% relative to, say, camera quality getting a score of 8%, battery life is 4 times 32 divided by 8, the importance of camera quality to this consumer. So, that information has been captured in these what are known as part worth utilities, sometimes just called utilities, sometimes just called part worths. So as I said, they're just weights representing the relative importance. And the bar graph is just, graphically representing what's going on there. Now, I've sort of emphasized what the bolded numbers mean. Well, it's not hard to interpret that if, a long battery life is worth 32 out of 100, some lower performance on that particular attribute must be some lesser number of 32, some smaller proportion. And you can see that the bar graphs are sort of representing, the step from, say, a short to medium is having a lesser importance than the step from medium to long in terms of this consumer's preferences. In other words, if these were my preferences, I get more of a kick in terms of how I feel about the phone if it were to go from medium to long than going from short to medium, and likewise for the other attributes as well. So this is capturing, you can see it graphically, if you like, the non-linearity of this consumer's preferences over different performances on the different levels for each of the attributes. Just sort of a footnote, it's sort of an old-fashioned word, but utilities is a Victorian word to describe, if you like, happiness or satisfaction. So these numbers are representing the happiness or the satisfaction that the person ascribes to each of these different components, attributes making up a smartphone. And the third thing, as I touched on already, is just sort of, they're called concepts or profiles, or more sort of generically alternatives, are just combinations of the different attributes representing particular things that we're looking at, and in this case, phones. So here's an example, and this is a screen from 1,000 Minds. So here are 8 concepts or alternatives, and they're just different combinations of the different features or attributes, including price, making up each of those different things. And there's the score based on the previous weights that we saw. So taking those numbers there, the software is just adding up for each of those different, those 5 different levels on the 5 attributes, see that they're all different for the 8 different concepts, adding those up, getting a score out of 100, and then ranking it. So this is making a prediction, if you like. Again, if these were my preferences, say, and these phones were available to me, the prediction from the conjoint analysis is that this consumer would prefer phone E, and then A right through, last of all, would be phone H. And again, you can see why this would be such useful information for a phone manufacturer or a marketing organization, because it's saying, it's making a prediction. You know, if you want to interest this consumer in buying your phone, the phones at the top of this list are the ones that you should be producing instead of the phones at the bottom of this list. So, you know, that's in a nutshell really what it's doing. So what I would like to do now, let me just send this link to everyone. There we go there. I've sent in the chat a link to the survey that you can see on the screen there. I would love it if everyone would just click on that link and experience a conjoint analysis, a very cut down version, just in the interest of time. There's the front screen there. Don't stress on it, you know, it's totally anonymous. Just rattle through it, give it some thought if you can, but it might take us a minute and a half or two at most, and then we'll have some results that we can talk about. Once you've done that, and if you get through it really quickly, and you can do it later on, if you're more interested in a conjoint analysis to choose a breed of cat, I've included a second link on the screen here. You can find it on the 1000 Minds website too if you want, or we can send it to you in the chat, to choose a cat. But that just seemed a little bit sort of frivolous in this example, and I know not everyone likes cats. So I'll stop talking for just a moment. If you will all just do your homework in this tutorial, if you like, and that will give me some results that I can talk about. I'll show you the results and talk about the interpretation, you know, resulting from a survey rather than just one individual. Is that okay with everyone? Everyone's fired up? Is that working? Give me a thumbs up, someone just that's getting through.
Good.
All good? Thank you, Franz. Marvelous.
And again, if you have any questions, feel free to just write in the chat and we'll help you out.
Yeah. So let's get to the results now. Actually, I'll just stay on the other one, I think. So feel free to, you know, chat away. You could be saying things like, oh, this is difficult, or this is easy, or anything like that. Again, don't take it too seriously. I just want you to experience it.
Yeah, to me, it's just like, I just ordered a new phone. I remember thinking like, oh, $500 is so much. And all your options here are like 600 and above. And I'm like, I don't want any of these.
I know. And I was also thinking when I was designing this, Petra, should I have these US dollars or New Zealand dollars or Australian dollars? But anyway, yeah.
To me, it's like anything that's above like 500, 600, I'm like, no, goodbye.
I know. And there's a lot of phones that charge a lot more than 1,000, so I could have kept going, but again, I didn't want to frighten people.
Send us the link for the cat breed research as well.
Oh yeah, sure, you've done it, great.
I would love to answer.
Yeah, okay. Well, if I put this up now, I worry that this is going to distract everyone. But what the hell? This is cool.
I promise I'm gonna answer, you know, later on. But
okay, that's for cats. In fact, I think my screen's showing it and I'm distracting everyone I know, but those are Franz, our partner in 1000 Minds, beautiful cats. We're all cat fans really, but I know everyone isn't. There we go there. Has everyone managed to sort of get through it okay?
Yeah.
Does anyone need any more time? And anyway, keep doing it. I'm
still working on it, so I think just 1 minute.
Yeah,
maybe.
yeah. But some people take this more seriously than others. The rest of us will just get through it.
I'm just struggling with my password at the moment.
Okay, great. Well, so I think my screen's sharing now, so keep finishing while you do it and I'll just talk. So I'm in 1000 Minds and I am going to talk about other software, but as I say, this is the one we know the most about. I'm in my 1000 Minds account. You can see my name up there. I should hide all these other things. I forget how to do that. Anyway, it doesn't matter. I'm looking at, I've run a survey, and that's what you've all been doing. In fact, we can look at the progress here. I'm going to show the results in a moment. Great, 16 people have finished. That's awesome. And so, drum roll, please. Let's look at the part worth utilities representing people's preferences. Okay, so bear in mind that survey that I sent out was deliberately short. You could only have 3 attributes. In many applications, you'd have more than that, of course. I wanted to make it as quick as possible. But here are just a subsample of the survey. 16 people did it, and each of these columns here, it was all anonymous. Of course, we could have asked for people's names, but we chose not to. So each of these columns is one of the participants in the survey. Now, where there's no numbers and just a hyphen, of course, is one of the attributes. You can see the attributes on the left-hand side where the person did not choose that as being an important attribute when they think about a smartphone. So for example, the third person here, they're not too worried about price, but they are worried about the other things that they chose: battery life, camera quality, and operating speed, and so on and so forth. So basically, what these data are showing us, and of course, in a large survey, I'd export this to Excel and look at the data that way too at the individual level, but we've got the means and standard deviation over here. But basically what we've got here is a codification of everyone's preferences, showing how they feel about the attributes that they chose, and the weights, the part worth utilities, are telling us about that. And of course, the mean is just taking, just adding across each of the rows and then dividing by 16, the standard way that you calculate a mean. And we could have a median as well, standard deviation, the same sort of statistical calculation. So the mean is representing the group as a whole. So let's just look at that out of interest. What's the most important thing? The most important thing for people remember it's out of 100, is price. Price is number one, followed by battery life, 23.8, and right down the least important thing is screen quality. So obviously that would be very useful information for someone trying to manufacture and to try and sell smartphones as well. So that individualized data is very interesting, and we can look at it in aggregate. And I'll just show a few other results as well. So those numbers, some people get a bit of a headache, but here's just another little summary, is based on those numbers above, the part worth utilities. Here's just a very simple representation of, a ranking across the 5 different attributes as to what was important. Everywhere we see a fourth equal, that's just where the person didn't choose. So this first person here chose price, operating speed, and battery life, and they didn't choose camera quality and screen quality. So that's been coded as being the fourth equal most important thing to them. But of course, we don't know how much they feel about it, but we do know that they care about the first 3 things. But we can start to see some patterns again. Price is coming out as most important for the majority of us. But there's some variation, so that this 6th person along here, for example, the thing they care about most is screen quality. They don't care about price.
That was probably me.
It's probably you, yeah. Yeah, well, maybe you love taking great photographs or making videos or things like that. So that's perfectly natural. And I will talk about techniques for sort of grouping the responses, a thing called cluster analysis, in just a moment. There's another graphical representation. Let's not worry about that too much. This is always too large for me. I'll just downsize that a bit. This is a radar chart, just a sort of a graphical way of representing every person's weights there. So each of those different colored triangles really shows a different person, and we can sort of see how they're grouped. And the dotted line, of course, is the mean. So of course, there's some variation, some very strong variation amongst the group as well. We can talk about things, if we just use the mean results, we can talk about the relative importance of each of the attributes for the participants overall. So this is what this sort of matrix is showing us. So for example, we at the average level, price was getting a part worth utility of 26.4 out of 100. If I focus on screen quality, remember that was the 5th most important thing across the group. The ratio of 26.4 to 14.7 is of course 1.8. So price is almost twice as important as screen quality to our 16 participants on average. Of course, that's not true of everyone. We can use this information to look at, well, how would each of the different phones, and I preloaded those in, so the screen I showed you before is loaded into this example, each of the descriptions on these phones. If we applied the part worth utilities for the participants, and here's just a subsample for 10 of them, we can see how, basically, again, making a prediction, these are sometimes called predictive algorithms in artificial intelligence land. For this person here, we predict that they would choose phone E and then phone D, and you can see the different numbers here are just showing the ranking. And again, there's a lot of variation, right? But on average, phone E is coming out as the most preferred phone, and phone H as the least preferred phone across the group, which is based on the part worth utilities for each individual, but also how those things were described. So, and there's a lot of other things we could dig into here, but you can see this is, pretty powerful information. Does anyone have any questions before I move on, just about some of these data and what they represent. I'll just pause for a moment if there are questions. Anyone want to jump in with a question or a comment? Anything I can clarify?
Not really, but I would like to know if you're going to provide some examples for cases when we have like multiple levels of criteria, like one criteria that's decomposed in two, and these two further decomposed in 4 or 6. Maybe some people have some more complex decisions.
Well, I guess so. We really don't go into that very much in 1,000 Minds. The usual way is we would just sort of split those out, those different criteria. You're saying the sort of different levels. We'd split those out as different attributes, if you like, at the sort of at this level here. So maybe camera quality you might think has say the movie side of how a phone works, but also how an actual photograph works as well. We would split that into 2 attributes in most cases, and likewise screen quality. If there were different components to that, that would probably split into two here at this level. Of course, the other way to do it is just to keep the attributes sort of at this aggregated macro level, and sort of have a reminder, screen quality, e.g., this feature and that feature as sort of a qualitative decomposition. But the point is here to try and keep it simple, because part of the problem is that the more attributes we add, as we add more and more to these things, of course, the survey gets
becomes cognitive, more.
That's burden. Right. Yeah. But certainly, I mean, there are ways to handle what you're saying, and just bear in mind, everyone, the survey that you just did, I made it deliberately as simple as possible. I'll talk about more complex ones in a moment. Okay, well, I might just move on then.
We have more questions.
And we'll come
Paul.
to lots of other examples.
Paul,
sorry, yeah, sure, great.
Bruno has his hand up, so if you want to.
Bruno, you're far away.
Yep, thanks. Hi, Paul. Sorry, I just missed the very beginning of the talk. So in your cell phone examples, you preloaded the attributes for each phone, right? So you gave a score or something like that for each attribute for each phone.
Yep, you can see it on my screen, I think. So there it goes. There we loaded, I just backed them in, and we could make these really detailed as well. I haven't done that deliberately to keep it simple, but yeah. And in fact, we can have, I wasn't going to go down this path, but just for fun, if you think about it, if we take all possible combinations, we can also look at those. So there are 405 ways that you can can combine 5 attributes with those different levels. So we can copy those in as well, and we can do that after the survey as well. So we don't have to do that before.
Okay.
We could do that afterwards. I just did that for the sake of the illustration. You're absolutely right, just so I could show something down here. Yeah. Does that answer your question, Bruno?
It does perfectly. Thank you.
Great. Anyone else?
And Bosco also has his hand up. If you want to meet yourself.
Yes. Thank you, and thank you, Paul, on this presentation. One question. Can we interpret part word utilities the same as utility function in multi-attribute utility decision making?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, pretty much we can actually. The interpretations are very, very similar. And that's, to be honest with you, that's why in 1,000 Minds we sort of do both sides. We do multi-criteria and conjoint analysis because the concepts are very similar. So yes, we can. We just probably use them for different decisions at the end. Obviously these are sort of marketing examples, but they're really in the same business, because what they're doing is they're creating predictive algorithms. They're predicting what people are going to do. And so they both areas, multi-criteria decision-making and conjoint analysis, come from the same area, human judgment and decision-making. That's right. But the funny thing is, in the sort of the broader industry globally, the 2 areas are kept very separate generally, but not so much for 1,000 Minds. Thank you. Any other questions? So I can't see the hands up, Petra, so you have to shout out.
No, that's it. Nobody else has their hand up.
Okay, great. So I'll just keep rolling, but we can talk at the end if there's other things as well, so don't worry about that. So so that was just a taste of a conjoint analysis. And again, do the cat one if you want. If you get sick of me talking, it's in the chats as well. That's kind of fun. So I'll just give you a bit more background. So, conjoint analysis, what a strange word. Why is it called conjoint analysis? Well, and this I think will improve our understanding of what the area is all about. It's really, conjoint is just another word for joined or combined. So conjoint analysis is when the different attributes that make up a product or a service are combined and offered to a consumer, and they're asked to make a choice. And that's why conjoint analysis oftentimes is also called choice-based conjoint analysis. We're making a choice. So the screen, one of the screens you saw would be one like this. And you notice that you're being asked to choose between phones where two attributes at a time were joined, conjoint, and you were asked to choose between them. Now, the feature of putting the attributes together is that you also had to consider a trade-off. So conjoint analysis often goes by the name, or it used to, but less so these days, as it was known as trade-off analysis. You're being asked to trade off, in this example, battery life for price. You could pay a little bit more and get a better battery life, or pay a little bit less and get a worse battery life. So conjoint analysis sometimes is called trade-off analysis, and it's often called discrete choice experiments, particularly in social sciences outside of marketing. And I think part of that is almost a snobbery thing. It lends sort of a pseudo, well, almost a physical sciences rigor to it. You know, we're having an experiment here, but the key words there is it's a discrete choice, and it's a discrete choice because you're being asked to choose between things. Would you have this one or that one? It's not saying, you know, on a scale from 1 to 9, do you feel stronger for this one or for that one, or anything like that. So it's choices between discrete options, and that's why these things are often called discrete choice experiments, or DCE. So to most people, but not to everyone, there is some debate sometimes amongst the theorists, you know, these terms, conjoint analysis, trade-off analysis, and discrete choice experiments are largely synonymous. Some other terminology that's worthwhile understanding is this whole area, and there are sort of other techniques as well, is commonly referred to as choice modeling, because we're modeling the choices that a person makes. Finally, the way that they're expressing their preferences is through stating them through sort of in an artificial experimental setting, and that's often contrasted to, for marketers, they might go and say, well, you know, what did people actually do when we observed them in the marketplace? How did they reveal their preferences by perhaps choosing things? So the experiment that we all did with the survey, you know, we were stating our preferences by answering those trade-off questions, but we could go out and look at the actual choices that consumers make for phones, and that would be a revealed preference. But those two approaches to understanding consumer decision-making, of course, are very complementary. You might run a conjoint analysis, a stated preference approach, as a precursor to running actual experiments, say in the marketplace. And obviously it's a lot cheaper to get people to talk about things rather than to sort of run experiments with real consequences. But the two things do go hand in hand. And conjoint analysis really arose to replace, you know, sort of approaches as illustrated on this screen, where people are asked to represent their preferences, but not by making any trade-offs. So, you know, we've all done surveys like this. My university, in fact, does this all the time with students, where people are just asked to rate whatever the thing they're being asked about. So, for example, battery life on a scale from 1 to 9, and then, you know, the different attributes here on a scale from 1 to 9. And of course, what happens, and I'm sure you can all see the problem, is most of us, when asked how important is battery life, are probably going to give it a 9. How important is a low price? Well, probably 8 or 9. And so everyone ends up sort of circling the numbers towards the far end of the scale, and we sort of get no discrimination. And it's not until people are asked to consider a trade-off do we sort of get a truer representation of how they feel. So questions like this are confronting people, you know, with the reality that you can't always have what you want. You've got to make trade-offs, and that's what life's all about. Whereas these questions, the answers tend to be sort of in the world of motherhood and apple pie. You know, everything's revealed as important, and so we can't sort of make any decisions about what we should do if we're trying to improve things. So there's 1,000 Minds. Of course, that's what I've been talking about, but there are other softwares available, and I'm confident there are several others too, but the other three on the screen here are probably the other sort of leading ones in this industry. This is from an old Wikipedia article that unfortunately this table got pulled down, but so just making you aware of that. The method that you were exposed to before is known as the Paprika Method. It's an acronym, of course. You can't be anything in this industry without an acronym. And I guess the key characteristic, I hope you found this, that even though the questions forced you to make a trade-off, they're not the hardest questions in the world. And being asked to choose one thing from two when they're differentiated on just two attributes at a time is something that most human beings can do. But you may have to answer, 20 or 30 questions depending how large the survey. There's a lot more information here, and sort of here's some of our intellectual property, if you like. But there's a nice link. Which I could perhaps I can't put that in there. Sorry, but if you go to our website, you can read about some of the nuts and bolts of the methodology. I just wanted to touch on the differences between the different methods. So you've experienced the Paprika method, and I won't go into details about the other ones, but there are some sort of three major characteristics that differentiate between the different approaches. And the first one is the difference between what is known as partial profiles versus full profiles. So what we were answering in our survey before were partial profiles. We're just looking at two attributes at a time from the set of 5 or the set of 3, even though you chose another one. So you weren't being exposed to everything all at once. Other methodologies throw everything at you all at once. And of course, the difficulty with an approach like that is, even though it might in some respects seem more realistic, it's sort of the choice that someone might make if they walk into the phone shop. At a cognitive level, a question like the bottom one here is putting a lot of load on our sort of thinking ability. And so a partial profile reduces that load, and therefore probably you can have greater confidence in people's answers. But that's the difference. And you can see the terminology: full profile, everything at once, it's the full representation. Partial, it's just looking at different combinations at different times. But again, probably quite a large number of them to try and capture people's preferences over the various combinations. Another distinguishing characteristic is what are known as Peerwise Comparison. So choose one thing from two. That's what you're doing with the Paprika method in 1,000 Minds, versus choose one from 4, or in some way put those 4 different things in order, maybe, and sometimes it's called max diff or best worst conjoint analysis. So you might get given 4 options like on the screen at the bottom there, and you're asked to say, well, which of those 4 is the best one, or the one I'm most likely to buy, which one is the worst one, or the one that I'm least likely to buy. And it's called max diff, because what it's asking you to sort of identify the best and the worst and ignore somewhere in between. But again, it's putting more load on people in terms of their thinking compared to a pairwise approach. And the other characteristic, I won't go into great detail about it, is conjoint analysis approaches such as 1,000 Minds are adaptive. So when you were answering those questions in the phone example, believe it or not, 1,000 Minds was thinking every time you answered a question, it was using your previous answers to work out what was the next question to ask you. So it was adapting. You were all asked different questions based on how you answered the questions that you did do. And that's, without getting into the technical details, to try and reduce the number of questions that would be asked, but in the process cover a very wide range of possible combinations. So other approaches don't do that. Before I get into the more real world examples, I'll just say a couple of other things. Yep, sure.
We have a question.
Oh, great.
Can you describe how multi-criteria decision-making is different from discrete choice experiments?
Well, what a question. Okay, well, just very briefly, well, I mean, multi-criteria decision-making is trying to help individuals and organizations to make a decision, like, what's our strategic direction, or what person should we hire for the job, or, what new product should we produce? So it's about decision-making, whereas conjoint analysis, even though it touches on people's decisions, is really trying to understand their preferences, so that we could use that information in the manner that I've been showing. Now, clearly, there's tremendous overlap between those areas, and that's why, again, 1,000 Minds treats the two things as sort of opposite sides of the same coin. But they're very different in terms of their application. Again, the decision-making is trying to, let's make a decision. Conjoint analysis is saying, well, let's try and understand people's preferences, get that information, and then we could do a number of things with it. We can talk about that in more detail afterwards if others would like to discuss that further. I just wanted to touch on very briefly the other analyses that are very commonplace, that are usually done with Excel. Certainly Excel can handle everything, but also other statistics packages. First is you can calculate what are known as willingness to pay, and I'm not going to go through the details of it. We can put some of these things up in another an email that goes around. We've got lots of information about, but here's an example of sort of the outputs. using the example that we did, in essence, we can work out, what would consumers on average be willing to pay for a longer battery life? So from the data that we got from the survey, and I'm not explaining how I'm doing it, but it's a very simple calculation to work out monetary valuations on non-monetary attributes in the survey, so long as we've got one attribute in the survey that does have a monetary dimension. We can use that, if you like, to back out, or to sort of work out in a backwards fashion what the values on the other non-monetary attributes are. So there's the willingness to pay. Consumers would be willing to pay these amounts of money for those improvements in the features. And you can see, why that's so important from a marketing point of view, because then you can work out, well, is it worth putting the effort into, improving our product if this is how much extra the consumers would be willing to pay? So there's more information on that. Now, the other thing, and I'll give some examples of this, so I won't explain it much now, is, we've got all this beautiful data from everyone who did the survey, just like I did for the phone survey. We've got 16 people's preferences now. We can cluster it or put them into different groups based on people's preferences. So cluster analysis is really like a market segmentation. We can find all the people who are very price sensitive. We can find all the people who are very interested in having a great phone, great camera, and we can group them accordingly, which of course is very useful for when we design marketing campaigns. In the 12 or 11 minutes that remain, I'm going to go very quickly through 3 examples, and these examples, all of them will give us illustrations of cluster analysis, so hopefully this will be a lot clearer. Okay, so the first one is really just another consumer-facing application, and this was trying to understand what do Vietnamese consumers care about when they go to buy milk powder. And so, this would be of great interest to a company like Fonterra or something like that produces milk powder and is trying to sell it into this market. So they ran a survey. You can see some of the data here with 272 participants in Vietnam. You can see the attributes down there that they considered were important, that these researchers discovered through focus group meetings and their own background information. There are the different levels. And there are the average results that came out from the 272 people. So for example, the most important thing to Vietnamese consumers on average is the quality and the safety control stamp. So in other words, knowing that what they're consuming, what they're giving their children is safe for them to consume. We can tell it's the most important because it's getting an overall weight of 33 out of 100. And everything else is obviously smaller numbers than that. And the least important thing that Vietnamese consumers worry about is the fat content on average. Now here's the cluster analysis. So using subsequent software like even just Excel, but other stats packages, you can get those 272 people to be split into different clusters or groups, and you can see the numbers here. These numbers all add to 272. So here's the first cluster, which made up 18% of the sample, and you can see the other numbers there. So there was a cluster of people who were similar with respect to how they felt, particularly about attributes that the researchers declared as being associated with a premium product type segment. And we can tell that because, look at country of origin to these consumers was by far and away the most important attribute. And look at that, for that group compared to these other groups, they really care about where the product's coming from. And they don't care very much about the price. So this would be a group, if you could identify these consumers, import your milk powder from somewhere fairly prestigious and charge them as much as you can get away with. That's what your marketing strategy would be for this group. There was another group who are very, and the largest group in fact, who are very concerned about food safety. And we can tell that. There's the part worth utility on that attribute, obviously very high for that group relative to the other groups. So, quite a different group. Look at the different part worth utilities relative to the first group, and so on and so forth. Another group very interested in nutrition. Maybe that's the group with young children, I don't know. Again, we can see those differences. I've circled them. And of course, there's a group that are most concerned with the price. So this would be a group that you'd be offering discounts to and finding pricing strategies that appeal to them, and you try and segment the market. So cluster analysis is a very, very valuable technique in conjoint analysis. And one of the strengths of a tool like 1000 Minds, not all softwares have this, by the way, is that the data that's being generated is at the individual level. So with that individual level data, we can start to do these other analyses, which are very, very informative. Here's a public policy application. This is from New Zealand. This was the New Zealand Treasury, which runs our government, basically. We're very interested in, what do New Zealanders want to see in their retirement or pensions policy in the future. And so here are, they called them criteria, but really they're attributes. Here are the attributes that they use for their survey. And you can see that they're all related to different features that you might include when you're thinking about a policy for people in their retirement, in their old age. Not every country has systems like this, but you pay your taxes when you're young, and other people pay taxes when you're old as well, and you get given money once you're, say, over the age of 65, or probably going to be over the age of 75 by the time I get there. So the question was, of these features, which are the most important? They asked a whole bunch of questions, again, using 1,000 minds to discover this. This, I know, is very sort of messy looking, but here's quite a nice summary of the results. So each of these graphs here shows a particular attribute in the conjoint analysis, and it's telling us what proportion of respondents, and they had about 1,500 people randomly drawn from the whole population do this survey. The vertical axis is showing us what proportion of the respondents ended up ranking that particular attribute as being the most important down to the least important. So you can see that this feature here is very, very important to New Zealanders, and that would, of course, would be something that policymakers would consider. Whereas this feature here, the size of the personal retirement savings, was the least important. So that's not really something that they'd have to worry about. So again, you can see that with information like that, very, very useful for design purposes. They did cluster analysis too. I won't go into the details here, it doesn't really matter, but they identified that there were sort of 5 groups of New Zealanders who felt quite differently about different aspects of that policy. And then you could break down the clusters and look at, well, are there differences? Do men feel differently than women in different ethnic groups, and where people live and how much income they have, and all sorts of things like that. So very, very useful to get to that level of analysis to inform policy. And then the final thing they did is they looked at 3 different possible policies that they were considering, and these names here are just little acronyms for them. So 3 different policies that were possible, and here's the different features that they have in terms of these different characteristics here. And then they used the part-worth utilities for the 1,500 people to see how those 3 policies would rank. And you can see, for example, that the policy called SAGO 65, and there's the features, the 3rd row there, was the most preferred by 58% of the population. But not everyone felt that way. Some people thought it was the worst based on these results. But this is a really nice way to do simulations to see what what people care about, and use that to inform decision making, use that to inform policy. And this is informing policy, I'm pretty sure. The final one, I've included this because it's quite a nice example. It's an environmental example, again at a population level, but looking at quite tricky issues. These were researchers, or are researchers, environmental researchers, very interested in how people, again, it's another New Zealand application, but how New Zealanders feel about what are known as marine protected areas. So around the coast of New Zealand, and this is probably happening in other countries as well, there are areas that have been made marine reserves and protected areas where you can go as a human being, to enjoy and observe nature, but you can't go in there and kill things. You can't catch fish. You can't, if you're a fishing trawler, you can't go in there and drag your net across the bottom of the ocean and destroy the coral. So they're protected to enable the fish and all the other animals that live there to regenerate and have a positive effect on other areas outside of the boundaries of these marine protected areas. But of course, it comes at a cost because it affects the recreational fishing behaviour. You can't go fishing in these areas. It affects commercial fishing. New Zealand's indigenous people, the Maori people, they have claims on those resources. They've been using these areas for hundreds and hundreds of years. But on the other side, there's some massive improvements in biodiversity. So it enables the environment to regenerate. So they ran a survey, a conjoint analysis survey, trying to discover how people felt about the sort of trade-offs between these different attributes. Here's the different levels here. And so that survey went out to a large number of people, and they wanted to discover these preferences so they could use it for policy purposes. So here are the mean results. There's the number. Over 1,000 people completed the survey. And it came out that what people cared about most on average, of course, differences amongst the group as well, was protecting the biodiversity. People really care about, looking after nature. But these other things are important as well. They included a tax variable because some of these policies would have financing implications. Would you be willing to pay more tax to support these initiatives? And of course, people don't like paying more taxes. They prefer to pay less taxes, but they included that to sort of gauge that sensitivity to the price, but it also enabled them to calculate willingness to pay as well. So, these results are very, very interesting from a perspective of thinking about what's the best way to design these protection areas that get the greatest benefit for the environment, but also satisfy people's preferences. Again, they clustered. So of those 1,055 people, they found that there were sort of 4 different groups that felt quite differently. So you can see that the largest cluster, cluster 1, comprised 43% of those 1,000 people, and they really cared, enormously. There's the average weight on biodiversity. So these are all the people who are very environmentally focused, and they didn't really care about the other things to the same extent. Oops, a bit of slide trouble there. There's another group who felt less put less importance on biodiversity and stuff, but they really cared about the effect on the Maori population with respect to their use of those resources. Another group that were very interested in the recreational fishing. That's probably people who go and take their kids fishing, and of course the commercial fishing. So again, the great thing about cluster analysis is it's recognizing people's differences as well as the mean results, and we can break people into different groups. The final thing they did is they could then try and work out, well, there's different scenarios that we could implement for managing these resources, these areas. What would people be willing to pay in terms of higher taxes per year to support these outcomes? And that's what the final analysis is doing. And I haven't explained that very, very well, but you can see, there's a lot of great uses that this stuff can be put towards. And I think that's pretty much me. And our timing is right to the minute almost. So that's my talk done. Does anyone want to chip in with some comments or questions? And again, very happy to go for as long as anyone would like to stay in the webinar. But I did just want to stick to time for people who have got other things that they need to do with their day. Thank you very much.
So we do have a question in the chat, and I believe it's about the milk powder example. If you can go back to that.
Yes. Yes.
There we go. So it's asking why is only the least given level have a higher value even for the country of origin?
The least given value.
The least given level has a higher value. I
wonder if, the first issue, I guess, is this ranking of the levels correct for the consumers? So it turns out that, at least based on the researchers' preliminary work, and they would have, talked to Vietnamese consumers, the least desirable country of origin was a product, a milk powder coming from inside Vietnam itself. I don't know what the reasons would be. Maybe there'd be issues of supposed prestige, maybe quality issues as well. And the most preferred was Western origin. I mean, that's pretty weird, but that was how the consumers saw it. And so, that's the most important thing, and that's why it's getting the most weight. That's the basic result. But of course, the great thing about cluster analysis, for a whole bunch of Vietnamese consumers, that wasn't very important compared to their other attributes. It was just to a subsample of 18% of the population who did the survey. I don't know if that makes sense. Thanks, Bruno. Good to see you. So does that sort of help? So, I mean, that's just a general result. But I think your question is touching on the issue. First of all, we've got to get sort of agreement on what the levels are. Now, in 1,000 Minds, I didn't have that set up in the survey. One feature, if you do the CAT survey, you'll see this. You can be asked in the first place to put the different levels in order for how you see those attributes yourself. And so for attributes that are, say, controversial, and country of origin certainly would be one, that would be a good option to include when doing a conjoint analysis. Give people the chance to do what's known as self-explicate, make those ranking decisions to begin with. But for other things, such as price, all else being equal, a low price is always preferable to a medium price, which is preferable to a high price. So we wouldn't need to do that for all attributes where the ranking is quite clear and uncontroversial. Great. Any other questions? Feel free to jump in, turn your mics on and let's have a chat about things. We don't have to do it by typing.
Yeah, go ahead, Felipe.
Well, I was responsible last semester for teaching an undergrad class about decision methods as in general, and then I tried to go through one method each class, and I spent a whole night with my students on 1,000 Minds, and I kind of collected some data about vegetarian hamburgers in Brazil with some hedonic and utilitarian variables. And well, the results were very, very interesting, but I do have a few things that I'm still unsure. I don't want to waste everybody's time on talking specifics, but I would like to know whether I could contact you about them. Maybe you could help me understanding them.
Yeah, I'd love to. And so that goes for everyone. Certainly, I'd love to help you, Felipe. But anyone, we can do, a one-on-one, and we can do it after this talk or schedule a time later on. Obviously, Zoom's very amenable for that. Always happy to help. And likewise, anyone else who's thinking of starting a conjoint analysis and would like some support to get going, or even just any questions about interpreting the results, it would be certainly my pleasure, and my colleagues as well. That's what we're here for. Totally. Love this stuff.
Another question, if you don't mind.
And can I just say too, vegetarian burgers in Brazil, that must be a difficult thing.
Not really. The vegetarian markets in Brazil has skyrocketed in the past 5 years.
Wow.
Yeah. Really, yeah. And that's exactly why we wanted to understand that. Is that because of an utilitarian frame of mind? Hedonic, maybe, and that's exactly what we wanted. We put vegetarian in the middle, some utilitarian on the side, some hedonic on the other, and we tried to understand how things worked. And I kind of was very interested in the end,
Yeah, well, I must admit, I had a master's student who did the same thing here in New Zealand. It's really taking off as well. And he got some really fascinating results. Actually, I could share those with you too if you wanted.
Actually, I would love to see your research. Well,
yeah, great.
I'll send you an email afterwards to talk
about lovely. Thanks, Carlos. Yeah. Okay. Anyone else got any comments or questions? And feel free to be as wide ranging as you want. It doesn't have to be just what I talked about.
Yeah. Bosco has a question.
Great.
Hey, Paul. Just one question. I mean. Every method, especially in MCDA, it has weaknesses, and you can find in scientific literature many critics of each method, and especially it's related to this behavioral aspect. I mean, probably the output of MCDA will depend on the structure of the decision-making problems. Sometimes it depends on the number of criteria, a number of sub-criteria, etc. So my question, because I didn't read too much basic literature related to conjoint analysis or discrete choice modeling. So in literature, what is the main weaknesses of this approach in the scientific literature? What is what people are criticizing?
Yeah, great question. I think the biggest criticism, actually, it comes back to my earlier point, the difference between stated preference and revealed preference. So the biggest criticism of conjoint analysis in general is that it's people just saying what they would do, that it's artificial, that it's not the real world for them, and that when they go into the phone shop, for example, they do something different. So that would be the general criticism. And then I guess, but of course that's been well tested. So like I've been using the terminology quite a bit already, what's coming out of these outputs are predictions. So we can test the predictions with what people actually do. And lots of studies have done that. And I think that's given a lot of confidence, actually, that conjoint analysis on the whole is very useful and quite predictive and therefore quite accurate and should be used. I guess the other criticisms come down to, I'm just flicking through my slides to come to it, is sort of these disputes within the industry itself of conjoint analysis about what's the right approach to go. So classic criticism would be, you know, I said that the top one, a partial profile like 1,000 Minds does, has the advantage of being, it's not a massive cognitive burden on the participant. They can understand what they're doing. You know, you guys all did it yourself. I think most of you didn't struggle too much when you did it. You got through it quite quickly. But the criticism would be that it's not realistic, whereas full profile, like this other example here, is realistic. However, it's cognitively burdensome. So like most things in life, there's a trade-off to be reached. So a lot of the fighting that goes on, if you like, within the profession is over things like this, but it does make a difference. And a lot of it is also constrained by the software technology that people have available to them. You know, prior to the widespread use of the internet and software, of course, a lot of these things were done with cards. They're done manually. And so a lot of that stuff was very, very constraining. I mean, I've seen full profile setups like this where they have, I think the biggest one I ever saw was they had 14 attributes on each side. You had to look at 14 different things and all differing and somehow weigh them up in your mind and make a choice. And not only with just 2 alternatives, some of them were these, like with four sets of 14 to choose between. For most people, of course, that's just mind-blowing, even for the smartest person in the world. It's not that people can't click one of the things. It's simply that when you go back and ask them to do it 3 weeks later, you get different results. And so therefore the results are unreliable. So a lot of the fighting's going on, if you like, the fighting in that respect. And then I guess the other thing is, a big issue, which I didn't touch on very much, just other than in passing, is what's known as survey design. If you're using a methodology that doesn't have the sort of adaptive nature, so when you did the survey in 1,000 Minds, you know, as I said, it was thinking after each question and therefore choosing another question to ask you. I mean, most software doesn't have that approach. They just basically set up a set of questions. Everyone gets asked a set of questions, and then it's sort of crunched out using statistical analysis. And that means they have to worry about, well, what questions do we ask people? And they've got to set up different questions for different groups, and then they sort of match them together. I mean, that's a real big issue as well, I think. And within the industry, you know, there's again quite a lot of arguing, or you know, takes place in conferences, of course, over, you know, what's the best technical approach. And this stuff gets very difficult very quickly mathematically and statistically in terms of what's going on in terms of the algorithm and the statistical analysis. And for most people, myself included, it's really quite difficult to follow some of the high level technical arguments, and they sort of just disappear into a world of, you know, sort of 5 people in the world being able to engage in that conversation, where and the rest of us, you know, are looking around for a practical solution. So I think those are the major issues that are discussed. And some of these things, obviously, for those of you who are fans and who do multi-criteria decision making, a lot of these issues, of course, translate right across into the world of multi-criteria decision making as well. I've just finished on one final point. Again, I hope I'm not giving anyone vertigo or speed wobbles, but again, it's the nature of these areas, the fact that they lie at the intersection of these different fields, that makes it very rewarding in terms of, you know, the ideas being shared across the boundaries, but also I think contributes to some of the disagreements. You know, like in this case, the marketing research people are very practically focused. They want to get out there and get information, and their bottom line is to try and, you know, find the information that they can use to make the right decisions when they're putting their marketing strategy together. The psychologists think about the world quite differently than the economists oftentimes. So, you know, it's definitely a growing field with lots of further developments, I think. And that's again why it's so great to be part of it. Did that sort of answer your question?
Yes, thank you, Paul. Thank you.
Thank you. Good question.
Okay, so the next one was in the chat, actually. In the case of a location of restaurant choice, there are 2 levels, downtown and suburban. So which one would be, I suppose, which one would be the lower level?
Oh, right. Okay, so that's a great question. So in that case, there's probably no correct answer to what's the right ordering with respect to where the location of the restaurant is for the choice, whether it's downtown or suburban. Some people will like suburban over downtown. Other people will like downtown over suburban. So in a software like 1000 Minds, that's where you would make it, as we call it, self-explicated. You would let the consumer at the start of the survey make their own particular choice. Yeah, so let the consumer decide. That's the best way to do it, and that's why we have features like that to enable the consumer to express their preference right at the front rather than having that imposed upon them. I don't know if that sort of answered the question properly. Maybe I could just actually go down and I'll try and illustrate that. I'm just flicking around and breaking all the rules I know, but sorry. I'll do if I do the cat one. Oops. This is sloppy, I know. I'm getting tired. If I illustrate with this cat one, for an example, what I mean by self-explication, if that wasn't clear. Okay, so here's the cat one. This is choosing the best cat. So what do I care about? Well, I care about these things in a cat, for example. Okay, so I've said those attributes are important to me. Now, 1000 Minds is going to ask me to start with, well, how do you feel about some of these levels? And it loads. Come in, spinner. That's very strange.
Maybe refresh the picture. I don't know.
Yeah, that's odd. Maybe someone's doing something. Well, this is embarrassing. Here we go. Never work with children, animals, or computers in show business, right?
Okay.
Well, we can scratch this one out of the video.
It seems that the person who asked the question is probably leaving anyway.
Yeah. Well,
but anyway,
I think I answered it, but I was going to try and demonstrate it.
Yeah, well, it's supposed to like ask you how you want to order. Like, do you care more about a long coat or a short coat, and then you just put it in the order that you yourself care about.
That's right.
Yeah.
Let's refresh that, Paul. It's working fine for me.
It's just Paul.
Yeah, it's just me. I'm out in the country. Right,
okay. Well, we do have a couple more questions if you want to move on. Or...
Yeah.
Okay.
Talk
so I
about
think,
yourself.
Felipe, did you have your hand up before? Or?
Yes, I did. I do have two questions. They're a bit technical, so if you really don't feel like answering them right now, I'll totally understand.
Because then we also have Carlos afterwards. So
okay.
I don't know.
I wouldn't mind if I kept my questions for the end. Don't worry. You can skip me.
Sure. Okay.
It's fine. So I'll just jump in now. It worked for us. So I was trying to show self-explication. So imagine I said that the cat, the coat of the cat, whether it's got short hair or long hair, is important to me as a consumer, right? What's the right ordering of these three levels on coat? Long hair, short hair, or Rex? Rex, by the way, means the cat has no hair. If you've ever seen Austin Powers, there's a cat in that called the Sphinx that has no hair, right? So the consumer can put those in order. So if this was me, I much prefer a cat with short hair. A bald cat doesn't really appeal to me, and I can't stand cats with long hair. So that would be the ordering that I would put. So, and now that will feed through to the conjoint analysis survey that I take. So that's a nice feature for attributes where it's not obvious what the ranking is. And similarly, I can do activity. I like a cat that moves around a lot. Not everyone feels that way. Some people want to, and now these questions that I answer will be based on that self-explication. So sorry that took a bit of time to load, but that's really a great feature. Sorry.
And also, another thing to point out is that when it asks you to put the levels in order, there's a text that you can edit. So tell them like, oh, some people prefer this, some people prefer that. So what do you prefer? Or put whatever you want. You can customize the text in the app.
Yeah. Sorry, there was another question. I went backwards at one.
Yeah. So Carlos was asking, could we use this type of analysis to see preferences for types of interventions done in a property? So for example, conservation actions like corridor, reforestation, introduction of wildlife, changes in land use.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, Carlos, that's a very similar application to the one I showed you at the end to do with protection areas in New Zealand. So it's really analogous to this. In fact, this I think is very similar. I think, Carlos, you're from Brazil, and so you're looking at protection areas amongst the jungle for the animals that live there. Well, they were doing the same thing here for protection areas in the sea, on the coast. So absolutely, that's a perfect application. Very, very, very similar and very successful. And I didn't say it clearly in my introduction to this area, but the reason that these researchers did this research was they actually wanted to find out what, you know, ordinary people felt, rather than what the organized, you know, people who have an interest in the fishing side of things. So the fishing industry were very strongly against reserves because it cut into their livelihoods. It's understandable they didn't like it. So what these researchers wanted to know was, well, you know, what do members of the general public feel, who oftentimes aren't represented in these decisions. They don't get a voice, and this was a chance to give them a voice, which is very important. I think that's an important aspect of conjoint analysis. You know, everyday people can answer questions like we've all experienced in today's talk, and we can see their results and use that information. Is that okay, Carlos? Did that answer? I think so. Might have gone. Oh, I can see there's new questions. Yeah, great. Sorry, I'm not using my chat very well. Yeah, right. So you did use it. I think we talked about that, didn't we? Yeah, your wildlife pictures.
A little bit different. It was the multi-criteria for evaluating the efficiency of different wildlife crossing structures, but
right.
And we're still working on that using the 1,000 mines, but this seemed like we have other issues now.
Yeah, and in fact, I mean, yeah, you're right, Carlos. Strictly speaking, you were doing more of a multi-criteria decision-making application, weren't you? And that is different from what I was talking about here. But in fact, you could do both. You know, you could do it very
here,
easily.
I mean, we're interested if we're going to do sort of like a marketing, invest on, you know, what are we going to do in the properties here? What is it that landowners are willing to would prefer or willing or not willing to do in terms of interventions? You know, it would be great to do a survey.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And by the way, the survey that we did today, you know, runs pretty well off a smartphone as well, which makes it more accessible to lots of people as well who don't have access to a laptop all the time. Yeah, great. Anyone else got a question? I'm just looking through the chat. I finally caught up on the chat. I'm sorry.
Okay. I think other than that, probably the only one left is Felipe, right? Or
yeah.
Oh, the question I have is actually quite simple. Two actually. First one would be, is there any way to do that within, you know, 1,000 mines? A way to balance reliability of answers, and what I mean by reliability is, for instance, asking about some preferences, and I do have some people who are more specialists, and some people are not exactly specialists or in a different scenario. It's a joint project. Some people are more specialists on one aspect, some other people are specialists on other things, and what I want is the people who are more specialists in both, but I do not want to dismiss the responses from the other people who are not as specialists as them originally. Is there any way to do this, to balance these kind of questions, responses?
Well, you could tag those people and just keep an eye on their different identities. So that's very easy to do. So you can set up your survey. I won't show you how to do it now, but you can set up a survey to, you know, and ask questions about their background and use that to qualify them. But what I am showing you now on the screen, I think I'm still screen sharing. You can also, because you mentioned reliability, you can set up a whole bunch of consistency checks and stuff like that, just checking out people's the quality of their data. So the screen I'm showing now is you can exclude people whose answers are inconsistent. So you can ask a couple of questions again of the survey at the end, repeat them. You can exclude people who answer really fast or people who just keep clicking the same button. So sometimes, I know that's not quite what you're asking, but this is a good way to, if you think that there are people who are less either committed to the survey or who know have less information, this is a good way to find them, as well as asking them obviously questions about their background and how they found the survey as well. So that's a very common approach. And then, you know, this information tags to each individual participant, and you can use that to filter them out. You can do it in 1000 Minds, you can do it in other platforms as well, to filter out those people whose results aren't so reliable, or who you have concerns about, and even test things like, for that group, did they express different preferences than the people that you have the greatest confidence in? So that, I mean, that's very common. These are all different ways of, I think, handling that problem.
I don't think I have explored it enough to see this page specifically, but it's good to know that there's a kind of options for that. Well, the other question I had is let's imagine that I'm collecting data, and people may be cautious about randomness. For example, if I consistently present an attribute first, it will give some sort of priming to prime people to answer that. How do you balance the randomness of the presentation of attributes with the solving of dominated pairs? If you don't want to go too technical, it's just for me to understand how can I, for example, explain that in a paper, for instance.
Well, I mean, the questions are being presented to start with in a random order. So that's the thing there. And it wasn't quite what you asked, but if you recall, I'll just show this here, the survey that people did in this webinar, for example, these attributes that were presented in the first place are appearing in a random order as well, so that people aren't drawn, say, to the one at the top. I know that's not quite what you asked, but we've taken care of those sorts of sources of bias by adding that randomness. So I think that's just a standard feature of 1000 Minds to try and avoid it, you know, but just by, again, mixing things up so that people aren't having sort of some of the decisions made for them by the way that things are presented, because as you are quite right to say, there are natural biases that people have, but that's just taken care of by the software.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. But if you want, you know, we can point you to
several other questions, but I'll send you an email later. I'm not gonna burden you with so many questions.
That's good. No, I appreciate your questions. It's great.
By the way, I'm not sure if this would be the right time to say, but we kind of turned this hamburger thing that we collected, and we kind of talked about it with the head editor of the Brazilian Journal of Marketing. He was very interested in us submitting a paper in a tutorial format, and maybe you could help us with that.
Yeah, sure. I'd love to, if I can, certainly.
Sure.
Yeah, great.
Okay. I'll send you an email about it later then.
Nice. Anyone else got any other questions? I think we've got.
Yeah. I don't know. Pascal, did you just forget to put your hand down, or do you have another question? Oh, I guess not.
No, I'm here, but I just forget to get down hand. Sorry.
Okay, yeah, I wasn't sure. I wasn't sure. And I was like, does he think I'm ignoring it? So I guess we're good.
I think we might be done then. So thank you very much, everyone who came along and who's still with us. It's been really great. If you want to get in touch with us, I think Petra's been putting a few things in the chat, but we're very easy to find, obviously online, and I think our emails and everything are available. We'd love to help if we can. So, and I'd like to thank Petra. I didn't do this at the start. I should have, for organising this and for running it so well as well. And everyone at 1000 Minds who made this possible, and especially to the participants who came along. So, might just sign off and go get another cup of coffee.
Thank you very much. You're a very approachable guy. I've always known that, but it was a pleasure talking to you, you know, kind of face to face. Thank you very much. Great presentation.
Thank you very much, Philippe. It's really nice to talk to you, and thanks to everyone else. So have a good day, everyone. Bye.